My own son-in-law tried to have me committed to steal my house, so I hit record. I know that sentence might sound like an exaggeration, like one of those stories you hear on television and think, that doesn't happen in real life. But it does happen. And it happened to me. My name is Robert Mitchell, I'm 68 years old, and until a few months ago I believed that family was a safe harbor, that my own blood would never betray me, that the man my daughter chose to share her life with would somehow be like a son to me too. How wrong I was. You know, when you reach almost 70 years old, you think you've seen everything in life. I worked 42 years at the same steel plant, raised my daughter alone after my wife died in a car accident. She was only 34 years old. Our Sarah had barely turned 8. I faced sleepless nights, tight budgets, teenage rebellion, boyfriends that kept me awake with worry. I thought the big challenges were behind me. The house where I live is simple, but it's mine. 3 bedrooms, a living room that still holds the couch where we watched so many Sunday movies, a kitchen where the smell of coffee always lingers in the air from 5 in the morning. I bought every brick with sweat, every faucet with overtime hours, every improvement with years of savings. It's not a palace, but it's my palace. It was in this house that I raised Sarah. It was in this kitchen that she studied for college entrance exams, at the dining table that we played cards on rainy nights, in the small backyard that we planted the first apple tree that now shades the porch. When she married Michael 8 years ago, I thought she would finally have someone to take care of her when I'm no longer here. Michael seemed like a good man at the time. He worked in sales, wore well-pressed suits, talked about plans for the future. Respectful to me, affectionate with her. At least that's what I saw. But there's something I learned from observing people for almost 7 decades. Not everyone who smiles at you wishes you well. Some smile because they're calculating what they can take from you. Lies may run fast, but truth always catches up. That phrase my mother used to repeat when I was a child, whenever my siblings or I tried to hide some mischief. At the time, it seemed like just a mother's saying, one of those you hear but don't pay much attention to. Today I know she was preparing us for life, because that's exactly what happened to me. Michael's lie ran fast, very fast. For months, maybe years, he planted tiny seeds of doubt about my mental capacity, subtle comments about my memory, delicate suggestions about my safety living alone, careful insinuations about how I could be better cared for somewhere else. And the truth? The truth was there, waiting for the right moment to appear. Everything changed on a Thursday in August. It was an ordinary night, one of those when I usually have my chamomile tea while watching the 8 o'clock news. The house was quiet. Sarah and Michael had had dinner with me and gone up to their room. They had been living with me for 2 years, since Michael lost his job, and temporarily came to live in my house to get back on their feet financially. Temporarily had already lasted 24 months. I was in the kitchen washing my cup when I heard voices coming from upstairs. It's not that I wanted to listen, but the walls in this house aren't very thick, and when someone speaks a little louder, especially in the room right above the kitchen, you end up hearing. At first it seemed like a normal conversation between husband and wife. But then one sentence made me stop completely. The cup still in my hand, the tap water running without me noticing. Once he's committed, the house automatically becomes ours. Those words came out of my son-in-law's mouth with frightening naturalness, as if he were talking about the weather, about what to have for dinner the next day, about what program to watch on television. My daughter responded with something I couldn't quite hear, but her tone seemed confused, as if she didn't fully understand what was happening. And then came the second sentence, even clearer, even colder. "Your father is old, Sarah. He's not going to live forever anyway. At least this way, we ensure he gets proper care." Proper care. What a nice way to disguise what he really wanted. I stood there in the kitchen, cup in hand, heart beating so hard I thought they might hear it upstairs. Because in that moment, Everything made sense. The comments about my memory, the suggestions about me maybe needing help, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Michael wasn't worried about me. He was planning to get me out of the way. And the most painful part of all, my daughter, my Sarah, the girl I raised with so much love, seemed not to fully understand but also wasn't defending me as I would have expected. I never imagined the greatest threat to my life would come from under my own roof. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling trying to process what I had heard. Had I misunderstood? Was my mind, after being questioned so much by Michael, really playing tricks on me? But no. I knew it wasn't. My mind is lucid, my memory is intact, and what I heard was real. It was in those dark hours of dawn, alone with my thoughts, that I made a decision that would change everything. If Michael wanted to play this game, he didn't know who he was messing with. I didn't build a whole life, didn't raise a daughter alone, didn't overcome all the difficulties I overcame to be defeated by someone who only saw an opportunity where he should see family. If he wanted proof that I was losing my mind, I was going to show him exactly the opposite, but not the way he expected. The next morning, I woke up with a plan in my head, a plan that would require patience, intelligence, and, mainly, evidence, because I knew that my word against his wouldn't be enough. I needed proof, and that's how it all began. But let me take you back to the beginning, so you understand how we got to this point. My life wasn't always complicated. In fact, for most of it, things were beautifully simple. I met my wife Margaret when we were both 19, at a church dance in our small town outside Detroit. She had the most beautiful laugh I'd ever heard, and when she smiled, her whole face lit up like sunshine after a storm. We married young, as people did back then. I was 21, she was 20. I had just gotten the job at Morrison's steel plant, and we rented a tiny apartment above Mrs. Henderson's bakery. The smell of fresh bread every morning became the soundtrack of our early marriage. Margaret got pregnant with Sarah when we were 25. I remember the day Sarah was born like it was yesterday. March 15, 1987. 7 pounds, 2 ounces of pure miracle. Margaret held her and said, "Robert, look what we made together." I cried like a baby myself. Those were golden years. We saved every penny to buy this house when Sarah turned 3. It wasn't much then. Needed new plumbing, the roof leaked in 2 places, and the kitchen hadn't been updated since the 1960s. But Margaret saw potential where I saw problems. "This house has good bones, Robert," she used to say, running her hand along the wooden banister. "Good bones just need love to become beautiful." She was right. We spent weekends fixing, painting, improving. Sarah would follow us around with her toy hammer, helping Daddy fix everything. Those Saturday mornings at the hardware store, Sarah riding on my shoulders while Margaret made lists of what we needed. Those are the memories that keep me warm on cold nights. Margaret made this house a home. She planted the garden, chose the colors for each room, hung family photos on every wall. The kitchen became her kingdom, always filled with the smell of something delicious cooking. Sunday dinners with Margaret's famous pot roast, Sarah chattering about school, classical music playing softly in the background. But life has a way of changing in an instant. Sarah had just turned 8 when we got the call that changed everything. Margaret had been coming home from her job at the library when a drunk driver ran a red light. The police officer who came to the door was young, probably younger than I was when I got married. He kept saying, "I'm sorry," while I stood there, not understanding how the most beautiful thing in my life could just be gone. Some lessons in life come too late to change anything. That's what I learned that day. You think you have forever, but forever can end on a Tuesday afternoon at 4:23 p.m. Suddenly I was a single father with an 8-year-old daughter who kept asking when Mommy was coming home. How do you explain death to a child? How do you tell her that the woman who tucked her in every night, who made her favorite pancakes every Sunday, who kissed every scraped knee better, is never coming back. I did the best I could. I learned to braid hair by watching YouTube videos. I figured out how to cook more than just scrambled eggs and grilled cheese. I attended every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game. Sometimes I was the only dad in a sea of mothers. But I was there. Sarah grew up to be everything Margaret would have been proud of. She was smart. Honor roll every semester in high school. She was kind, always bringing home stray cats and stories about helping the new kids at school. And she was determined. When she decided she wanted to be a teacher, nothing could stop her. She went to Central Michigan University, got her degree in elementary education, and moved back home while she looked for a teaching job. Those were good years, just the two of us again. She'd grade papers at the kitchen table while I watched the news, and we'd talk about everything: her students, my work, her dreams of having a family someday. That's when Michael came into the picture. Sarah met him at a teachers' conference in Grand Rapids. He was working for an educational supplies company, selling materials to schools. When she first brought him home for dinner, he seemed pleasant enough. He was well-dressed, polite, knew how to shake hands firmly and look a man in the eye when he spoke. "Mr. Mitchell," he said that first night, "Sarah talks about you all the time. I can see where she gets her strength from." I wanted to like him. Sarah was 26 then, and I knew she was ready to build her own life. Every father knows that day is coming, when someone else becomes the most important person in your daughter's world. Michael seemed to fit the bill. He had a steady job, drove a reliable car, talked about wanting kids someday. He was respectful to Sarah, opened doors for her, seemed to listen when she talked about her teaching. But there were small things that bothered me, even from the beginning. Things so subtle I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. Like the way his eyes would scan the house during that first dinner. Not looking around like someone getting familiar with a new place, but assessing, like he was taking inventory. Or how he'd make little comments about the house being too much for one person to maintain. Always said with a smile. Always couched as concern for my well-being. "You know, Mr. Mitchell, this is a big house for just you. Have you ever thought about downsizing? Might be easier to manage." I'd brush it off, tell him I was managing just fine, thank you very much. But the comments kept coming, visit after visit. "Sarah mentioned you had some trouble with the furnace last winter. These old houses can be real money pits, can't they? Wow, this yard must take forever to mow. At your age, Mr. Mitchell, you should be relaxing, not doing all this yard work." Always at your age. Like 60-something was 1 foot in the grave. Sarah didn't seem to notice. Or if she did, she didn't say anything. She was happy, and I wanted her to stay happy. Love makes you blind sometimes, even to red flags that seem obvious in hindsight. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. I'll give him credit. He asked for my permission first, like a gentleman should. Came over on a Sunday afternoon, nervous as a schoolboy, tie perfectly straight. "Mr. Mitchell, I love your daughter very much, and I'd like to ask for your blessing to marry her." What was I supposed to say? She loved him. She lit up when he walked into a room, laughed at his jokes, talked about their future together with such excitement. How could I say no based on a feeling, a few odd comments, a sense that something wasn't quite right? So I said yes. And they were married in the little church where Margaret and I had our wedding. Sarah wearing her mother's dress that we'd kept preserved all those years. She looked so beautiful walking down that aisle, and for a moment I could see Margaret in her smile. The first few years of their marriage seemed happy enough. They bought a small starter home across town, and I'd see them for Sunday dinners and holidays. Michael seemed to settle down a bit, stopped making so many comments about my house and my age. I thought maybe I'd been wrong about him. But then Michael's company started having problems. Sales were down, territories were being eliminated. He was working longer hours for less money, and the stress was showing. Money troubles have a way of revealing who people really are. That's when the real Michael started to emerge. It began with small comments again, but different ones now. Comments about inheritance, about planning for the future, about making sure family assets were properly managed. You know, Robert, he'd started calling me by my first name without asking, which always rubbed me wrong. You really should think about estate planning. A house like this, with property values going up, it's going to be a significant asset someday. Sarah should know how to handle it. Or, have you thought about adding Sarah's name to the deed? Just makes things easier if something happens. Prevents all that probate nonsense. I'd been managing my own affairs for 68 years. I didn't need a son-in-law who couldn't keep his own job telling me how to handle my house. But the comments got more frequent, especially after they had to move in with me temporarily, when Michael lost his job, and they couldn't make the mortgage on their place. Temporarily was stretching into its second year, and Michael seemed less and less interested in finding new work. He'd sleep until 10, spend his days networking and exploring opportunities, which seemed to involve a lot of time on the couch watching television. Meanwhile, Sarah was teaching full-time and picking up extra tutoring work to help pay their bills. I watched my daughter working herself to exhaustion, while her husband treated my house like a hotel he didn't have to pay for. That's when the memory comments started. Robert, didn't you already tell us this story yesterday? Are you sure you took your medication this morning? I thought I saw the same pills in the container. Sarah, did you notice your dad seemed a little confused when the neighbor was talking to him? Always said with such concern, such loving worry, and always in front of Sarah like he was trying to plant seeds of doubt in her mind. The worst part? Sometimes Sarah would get this worried look on her face, like she was starting to see what he wanted her to see. The cruelest lies are the ones wrapped in fake concern. I knew my mind was sharp. I could remember things from 50 years ago like they happened yesterday. I balanced my checkbook to the penny every month, never missed an appointment, could tell you the birthday of everyone in my family going back 3 generations. But when someone questions your memory every day, when they make you doubt yourself little by little, it starts to get to you. You begin second-guessing yourself. Did I already tell that story? Am I repeating myself? That's exactly what Michael was counting on. The breaking point came on a quiet evening in late July, just a few weeks before that fateful Thursday when I heard his true plans. Sarah was at a curriculum planning meeting at school, and it was just Michael and me in the house. I was reading the newspaper in the living room when Michael sat down across from me, leaning forward with that serious expression he wore when he wanted to seem concerned. Robert, I need to talk to you about something, and I hope you won't take this the wrong way. I looked up from my paper, already knowing I wasn't going to like whatever came next. I'm worried about you. We both are. Sarah's too kind to say anything, but I can see how stressed she is about your situation. My situation? Your memory issues, Robert. The confusion. Yesterday you asked me 3 times what day it was. Last week you left the stove on all night. Sarah found it still burning when she got up for work. That was a lie. I never left the stove on. But the way he said it, with such conviction, such sincere worry in his voice. For a split second, I almost believed him. I think it might be time to consider some options. Adult care facilities these days are really nice. You'd have people looking after you, making sure you take your medication, social activities with people your own age. He was testing the waters, seeing how I'd react to his plan. I set down my newspaper and looked him straight in the eye. Michael, my mind is as sharp as it's ever been. I don't have memory issues. I'm not confused, and I certainly don't need to be warehoused in some facility. This is my house, I built this life, and I'm perfectly capable of managing both. He held up his hands like he was backing off, but I could see something flicker in his eyes. Frustration, maybe. Or calculation. Of course, Robert, I didn't mean to offend you. I'm just concerned, that's all. We both are. But I knew better now. This wasn't concern. This was strategy. That night, after Sarah came home and they'd gone upstairs, I sat in my kitchen thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The comments about the house, the questions about my memory, the suggestions about better care. I realized that Michael had been playing a very long game, and I was just starting to understand the rules. That night I heard something behind the door that would change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because what I heard that Thursday night wasn't the beginning of Michael's plan. It was just the first time I caught him saying it out loud. The seeds had been planted long before that, and now I could see exactly how they'd been growing in the dark, fed by small lies and fake concern, reaching toward the light of my inheritance like weeds in my garden. But weeds, I've learned, can be pulled up by the roots if you know where to look. The days after that conversation in the living room felt different. The air in my own home felt thick, heavy with things unsaid. Every casual comment from Michael now landed like a carefully placed chess piece, not friendly conversation. I watched him. I watched Sarah. I saw the way she'd sometimes look at me after he'd made one of his concerned remarks. A tiny frown, a flicker of doubt in her eyes before she'd shake it away. It was that flicker that scared me the most. It was the crack where Michael was wedging his lies. I couldn't just get angry. I couldn't accuse him without proof. Sarah loved him, and a part of her would always side with her husband. If I came out swinging, I risked pushing her right into his arms and losing her completely. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to be the man Margaret believed me to be. Steady, patient, and thorough. The quickest hunters are the ones who catch their prey. So I started my own quiet investigation. The first thing I did was buy a small spiral-bound notebook from the drugstore. I hid it in the bottom drawer of my bedside table under my sweaters. In it, I began to keep a journal. Not a diary of feelings, but a log, a record. Every time Michael made a comment about my memory, I wrote it down. Date, time, what was said, who was present. July 28th, 7 to 15 p.m. Michael asked at dinner if I was feeling confused today. Said I'd told him the same story about the plant's summer picnic 3 times. I told that story once. August 2nd, 10:00 a.m. Michael mentioned to Sarah that I must have forgotten to take my blood pressure pill because it was still in the weekly container. I had taken it with my morning coffee, as always. I also started paying attention to things around the house. I'd notice if a drawer was left slightly open, if papers on my desk looked like they'd been moved. Michael was often home alone while I ran errands or Sarah was at work. One Tuesday I came back from the grocery store to find him in my study, looking at the bookshelf. "Just dusting in here, Robert," he said a little too quickly. "These old books hold a lot of value, you know. First editions, maybe?" He wasn't dusting. The cloth in his hand was clean. Another time, I pretended to go to the basement but stopped on the stairs. I heard the quiet click of my filing cabinet drawer opening and closing upstairs. He was looking for something. Papers, deeds, insurance policies. My blood ran cold. This was no longer just nasty comments. This was a reconnaissance mission. I needed more than a notebook. I needed irrefutable evidence. That's when I remembered the smartphone Sarah had insisted I get for emergencies. It mostly sat on its charger, a confusing slab of glass and metal. But it had a microphone. It had a camera. The next day, I told them I was going to the library for my usual Wednesday visit. I put on my jacket, walked out the door, and got in the car. I drove around the block and parked 2 streets over. Then I walked back home, let myself in as quietly as I could through the back door, and went straight to the basement. I sat on an old stool next to the furnace, the hum hiding any small noise I might make. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my ears. I felt like a stranger in my own home. I felt foolish. And then I felt angry. Angry that he had reduced me to this, hiding in my own basement. I didn't have to wait long. I heard his footsteps above me, pacing in the living room. Then his voice. He was on the phone. "No, he just left. Yeah, the usual story. Off to read his newspapers. I know, it's taking too long. I've been planting the seeds for months now. Sarah's starting to see it, I think. She mentioned yesterday that he did seem more forgetful lately." There was a pause. I held my breath. "The house is the key." "Yeah, completely paid off. We just need to get him declared incompetent. Dr. Evans says he can help with the evaluation for a cut. Once we have guardianship, we can sell it, split the proceeds, and be done with it. Sarah will be upset, but she'll get over it. She always does." I sat there in the semi-darkness, the words washing over me like ice water. Dr. Evans, incompetent, guardianship, for a cut. It was all real. It was so much worse than I had imagined. He had a doctor involved. I fumbled for the phone in my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I opened the voice memo app, my fingers clumsy on the touch screen. I pressed record just as he started speaking again. "Look, the old man's not getting any younger. Honestly, it's a mercy. He'll be somewhere they can monitor his medication, and we'll be set. It's a win-win." I got it. I got about 3 minutes of it. Enough. He thought the walls were his ally, but they were mine. When I heard him hang up and go upstairs, I waited another 10 minutes before sneaking out the back door and walking back to my car. I drove to the park and sat there, the recording saved and backed up to the cloud, as Sarah had shown me how to do. I had my proof, but what good was it? I played it for myself, listening to the cold, calculating tone in his voice. This would destroy Sarah. It would shatter her world. I couldn't just show her. I needed a witness. I needed someone on my side. I thought of Margaret. What would she have done? She would have been calm. She would have been smart. She would have found an ally. And I knew exactly who to call. My old friend Ben. Ben Walters and I had worked together at the plant for 35 years. We'd seen each other through promotions, layoffs, births, and deaths. He was a man who knew the value of silence and the weight of a promise. He was also the only person I knew who wouldn't think I was going senile. I drove to his house right then and there. I didn't say much at first. I just handed him my phone and told him to listen. I watched his face change from confusion to shock, and then to a deep, cold anger. He took off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, a habit he'd had for 50 years when something truly upset him. When it finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at me, his eyes sharp. "Robert," he said, his voice low and serious, "what in God's name have you gotten yourself into with this son-in-law of yours?" "I need your help, Ben," I said, my voice sounding tired even to my own ears. "I need you to be my witness. That this is real, that I'm not making it up, that my mind is sound." "You have more than a sound mind, you old fool," he grumbled. "You have the patience of a saint for not having thrown that weasel out on his ear already." He handed me back the phone. "Of course I'll be your witness. What's the plan?" I didn't have a plan yet. Not a full one. But I knew the next step. I had to keep gathering evidence. I had to be ready for when Michael made his move. Ben agreed to be my silent partner. We worked out a system. If I felt something was about to happen, I'd call him and leave the phone line open. He'd listen, and, if necessary, come over. I went home that evening, the weight of the secret heavy on my shoulders. Sarah was setting the table for dinner. She smiled at me, a tired but genuine smile. "Hey, Dad, have a good day at the library?" "Yes, honey," I said, my heart aching for her. Very productive. Michael was lounging on the couch, watching TV. He didn't even look up when I came in. "Everything all right, Robert?" he asked, his eyes glued to the screen. "You seem tense." Every lie he told was a thread, and I was starting to pull on them. The noose was tightening, but around whose neck? I knew it was only a matter of time before Michael and his doctor friend made their play. The evaluation. The commitment hearing. They had a plan. But now so did I. The invitation came exactly 1 week later. Not from Michael, but from Dr. Evans himself. A phone call to the house landline. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Dr. Evans from Maple Grove Care Center. I'm following up on a referral from your family regarding a wellness check. They're concerned about some memory issues. I'd like to schedule a time to come by and do a brief assessment." My hand tightened on the receiver. The trap was being set. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. They were using the language of concern as a weapon. "Of course, doctor," I said, my voice remarkably steady. "How about next Thursday evening? My daughter and son-in-law will be here. I'd like them to be present. I wanted them right where I could see them." "Thursday is perfect," he said, a note of smooth professionalism in his voice. 7 o'clock? 7 o'clock it is." I hung up and took a deep breath. It was happening. The wellness check was the first step toward the declaration of incompetence, toward guardianship, toward my house. I called Ben immediately. "It's on, Thursday at 7. "I'll be there," was all he said. The next few days were the longest of my life. I moved through my routines, making coffee, reading the paper, tending the garden, but it all felt like I was acting in a play. I was playing the part of Robert Mitchell, the forgetful old man, while inside, every sense was on high alert. Michael was practically buzzing with a suppressed energy. He was being unusually helpful around the house, overly solicitous. "Let me get that for you, Robert. You look tired. Why don't you sit down?" Each act of fake kindness was another twist of the knife. Sarah, God love her, was just worried. She'd look at me with those big, concerned eyes, and it broke my heart. She was being manipulated by the man she loved, and she had no idea. She was seeing the fiction Michael had created for her. Thursday arrived. I put on a clean shirt. I wanted to look presentable. I wanted to look capable. At 6:55 p.m. the doorbell rang. Michael practically sprinted to answer it. There stood Dr. Evans, a man in his late 50s with a too-tan face, a perfectly tailored suit, and a leather briefcase that looked expensive. He didn't look like a doctor who made house calls. He looked like a banker. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that was just a little too firm. "A pleasure. And you must be Sarah and Michael." He was all smiles, all charm, the perfect hired gun. We sat in the living room, the same room where Michael had first suggested I needed options. The irony was not lost on me. Dr. Evans made small talk for a few minutes, then opened his briefcase and pulled out a clipboard. "Now, Mr. Mitchell, if you don't mind, I'd just like to ask you a few questions. Standard procedure." He began with simple things. "What day is it? Who is the president?" Count backward from 100 by sevens. I answered everything calmly, correctly. I could see Michael's smile beginning to tighten at the edges. Then the questions got more pointed. "Now, Robert, may I call you Robert? Your family tells me you've been having some trouble lately. Forgetting to take your medication? Perhaps leaving appliances on?" This was it. The fabrication. I didn't get angry. I didn't deny it. I just smiled a small, quiet smile and looked past the doctor, to the hallway where I knew Ben would be standing, right on time. "Actually, doctor," I said, my voice clear and loud, "I think there's been a misunderstanding, and I've invited a friend to help clear it up." "Ben?" The front door, which I'd left unlocked, opened. Ben walked into the living room, his presence filling the space. He held his own phone in his hand. He gave me a slight nod. The room went dead silent. Sarah looked confused. Michael looked pale. Dr. Evans looked annoyed. "What is the meaning of this, Robert?" Michael said, standing up. "This is a private medical assessment." "I think the assessment is over, Michael," I said, not taking my eyes off Dr. Evans. "I believe the doctor was just leaving." Dr. Evans began to pack up his clipboard, flustered. "This is highly irregular. I was asked to perform an evaluation based on credible concerns. Credible concerns? I asked. Or a credible payment? His head snapped up. I beg your pardon? Ben stepped forward. I think you should hear this first, doctor, before you talk about credibility. He held up his phone and pressed play. The recording from my basement filled the room. Michael's voice, clear as day. We just need to get him declared incompetent. Dr. Evans says he can help with the evaluation, for a cut. The color drained from Dr. Evans's face. He looked from the phone to Michael, his expression one of pure panic. He had been caught. His professional reputation was on that recording. Michael looked like he'd been struck. That's a fake. That's edited. He's confused. You can't. It's not fake, Michael, Ben said, his voice like granite. I was on the other end of the line when you said it. I heard it live. I'm a witness. But the real twist, the moment that changed everything, came from Dr. Evans. He saw his entire career flash before his eyes, and he chose to save himself. He pointed a trembling finger at Michael. You! He spat, his smooth demeanor gone, replaced by raw fear. You told me his family was fully supportive. You told me his daughter was begging for an intervention. You said you had power of attorney. The lawyer's confession changed everything. The room was frozen. Sarah was staring at Michael, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning horror. The pieces were crashing together in her mind. All his comments, his concerns, this doctor here now, denying everything. Michael's house of cards collapsed in that moment. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He had no lie left to tell. Dr. Evans grabbed his briefcase, shoving papers inside. I want no part of this. This is fraud. This is elder abuse. He practically ran for the door, leaving without another word. The front door slammed shut. The sound echoed in the silent living room. Sarah finally found her voice. It was a whisper, broken and hurt. Michael? What did you do? He turned to her, his face a mask of desperation. Sarah, baby, you have to understand. It was for us, for our future, the house, the money. We could have been set for life. She stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. And in that look, I saw the death of her love for him. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, devastating disappointment. Get out, she said, her voice trembling but clear. Get out of my father's house, now. He left with nothing but the lies he came with. Michael looked at her, at me, at Ben. He had lost. He had lost everything. Without another word, he turned and walked out the front door, into the night. The sound of his car starting and driving away was the sound of a chapter closing. The silence he left behind was heavy, painful, and full of tears yet to be shed. Sarah stood there shaking. I went to her and wrapped my arms around my little girl, as I had when she'd skinned her knee or had a bad dream. Only this pain I couldn't kiss away. I'm so sorry, Dad, she sobbed into my shoulder. I'm so sorry I didn't see it. I'm so sorry I believed him. Shh, I whispered, holding her tight. It's not your fault. You saw the man he pretended to be. I'm just sorry I had to be the one to show you who he really was. We stood there for a long time, in the quiet living room of the house I'd built, surrounded by the ghosts of happier times, holding on to each other as the foundation of our family shifted beneath our feet. The battle was over, but the war to heal had just begun. The silence after Michael left was the loudest sound I have ever heard. It wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy, wounded thing, filled with the echo of slammed doors and shattered trust. Sarah was trembling in my arms, her sobs quiet but deep, shaking her entire frame. I held her, my own eyes dry but my heart feeling like it had been cracked down the middle. Ben, God bless him, knew exactly what to do. He moved through the living room with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd seen his share of crises on the factory floor. He picked up the forgotten clipboard Dr. Evans had dropped, gathered the scattered pens, and went into the kitchen. I heard the familiar sound of the kettle being filled, the click of the stove, the quiet clatter of cups. He was giving us space while holding the fort. It was the most valuable thing anyone could have done. Eventually, Sarah's tears subsided into hiccuping breaths. She pulled back, her face blotchy and her eyes red-rimmed. She looked at me, really looked at me, and the guilt in her expression was a physical weight. "Dad, I don't even know what to say. All those things he said. I almost—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The horror of having doubted me was worse, in that moment, than the betrayal of her husband. I cupped her face in my hands, my thumbs wiping away the tears on her cheeks. "Sarah, look at me. You were manipulated by someone you loved, someone you trusted. That doesn't make you a fool. It makes you human." I took a deep breath. "The important thing is what we do now. Together." Ben came in then with a tray holding 3 steaming mugs of tea. He set it down on the coffee table. "Sugar's in there," he said gruffly, nodding to the bowl. "Both of you need it." We drank our tea in silence for a few minutes, the warm liquid doing little to thaw the cold knot of dread in my stomach. The immediate threat was gone, but the legal and emotional fallout was just beginning. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice small. With Michael?" This was the hard part. The necessary part. This was where I had to stop being just a comforting father and start being a pragmatic head of the household. I had to set the boundaries, not out of vengeance, but for our survival. "Now," I said, setting my cup down with a firm click, "we protect what's ours, and we protect each other." The next morning, I called my own lawyer, a serious woman named Ms. Davies who had handled my will and estate planning for decades. I didn't tell her the whole story over the phone, just that I needed to discuss an urgent matter of elder fraud and coercion. Sarah and I went to her office together. Sitting side by side in front of the large mahogany desk, we told her everything. I showed her my notebook log. I played her the recording. Sarah, her voice shaking but clear, confirmed the events of the previous night. Ms. Davies listened without interruption, her face a mask of professional calm. When we finished, she removed her glasses and sighed deeply. "Robert, Sarah, I'm so sorry you've had to go through this," she said, her voice softening for just a moment before turning all business again. "This is a serious case of attempted financial abuse and fraud. You have evidence. You have a witness in Mr. Walters. And you have the testimony of the coerced doctor, which we can likely obtain." She laid out our options. We could press criminal charges. We could file for a restraining order. We could sue for civil damages. I looked at Sarah. Her face was pale. The thought of dragging this through a public courtroom, of airing our dirty laundry for the world to see, was clearly horrifying to her. "I don't want to destroy him," she whispered. I want him to go away. I want to be safe." I understood. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about security. It was about drawing a line in the sand so bold and permanent that Michael would never dare cross it again. "Ms. Davies," I said, "I don't want to see him in jail. I want to see him out of our lives, permanently. What is the strongest way to ensure that?" We decided on a strategy. Ms. Davies would send Michael a cease and desist letter, detailing the evidence we had and outlining the criminal charges we could pursue. Attached would be a legally binding agreement. In it, Michael would voluntarily agree to a permanent restraining order, relinquish any and all potential claims to my property or assets, and agree to a swift, uncontested divorce from Sarah. In return, we would not pursue criminal charges. It was an ultimatum, but a merciful one. He would walk away with his freedom, but nothing else. Justice isn't about winning. It's about peace. The package was sent. 2 days later, Ms. Davies called. The agreement had been signed and returned by overnight mail. There was no note, no apology, no request to speak to Sarah. Just a signature on the dotted line. He had chosen self-preservation, as I knew he would. The chapter on Michael was closed. legally at least. The emotional work took longer. Sarah moved her things out of the room they had shared and into her old childhood bedroom. Some days were better than others. Some days she was my strong, capable daughter, talking about lesson plans and new beginnings. Other days, I'd find her sitting on the porch, staring at the apple tree we'd planted so long ago, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. We started talking again, really talking like we hadn't in years. We talked about her mother. We talked about her childhood. We talked about what she wanted for her future, now that the future she'd planned had evaporated. I never said, "I told you so." There was no point. The consequences of Michael's actions were teaching her everything she needed to know. She was learning to trust her own instincts again, to see the difference between love and manipulation. I was learning too. Learning that it was okay to be vulnerable with my daughter, to show her that I needed her just as much as she needed me. We were rebuilding our family, just the two of us, on a new foundation of honesty and hard-won trust. One Saturday afternoon, we were in the garden pulling weeds. The sun was warm on our backs. It was quiet, the only sound the scrape of our trowels and the birds in the oak tree. "You know," Sarah said suddenly, her hands deep in the soil, "he never liked gardening. He said it was a waste of time, that you couldn't monetize dirt." I looked at her, surprised she could speak of him so calmly. She looked up and met my gaze, a new strength in her eyes. "I loved him, Dad, but I don't think I ever really liked him. Does that make sense?" It made perfect sense. It was the truest thing she'd said in a long time. We went back to weeding. The past wasn't forgotten. It was simply being composted, turned over, making way for new growth. The legal papers were filed. The divorce would be final in a few months. The house was quiet, but it was our quiet again. The coffee smelled like coffee. The memories in the walls felt like blessings, not burdens. The war was over. We had defended our harbor. And now slowly, we were learning to live in the peace we had fought so hard to protect. Justice, I learned, doesn't always look like a courtroom drama. Sometimes it's the quiet, solid click of a lock on a door that will never open for a certain person again. It's the peace of a Saturday morning, drinking coffee in a kitchen that is truly yours. It's the sound of your daughter's laughter returning, hesitant at first, then stronger, freer, as the weeks turned into months. The legal papers were finalized. The divorce was granted. Michael was gone from our lives, not with a bang, but with the silent, efficient scratch of a pen on a legal document. Our victory wasn't celebrated. It was breathed in, like the first deep breath after you've been underwater for too long. Sarah and I didn't just go back to how things were. You can't. A betrayal like that leaves a scar. But we built something new, something stronger on top of that scar. We talked more. We listened better. The trust between us wasn't the innocent, automatic trust of father and little girl anymore. It was the chosen, hard-won trust of two adults who had looked into the abyss together and decided to hold on tighter to each other. I often thought about what we had almost lost. The house? Yes, that was a part of it. This home that Margaret and I built, where Sarah took her first steps. But the real loss, the unthinkable one, would have been the trust between me and my daughter. That would have been the true theft. Michael couldn't just take my house. He tried to take my credibility, my sanity, and my relationship with my only child. He failed on all counts. The greatest victory wasn't keeping my house, it was keeping my peace. I learned about boundaries. I used to think setting boundaries was about building walls, about shutting people out. Now I understand it's the exact opposite. It's about drawing a circle around what is sacred, your peace, your dignity, your truth, and protecting it so you can be a fuller, more present person for those you truly love. Saying no to Michael's toxicity was what allowed Sarah and me to say a fuller, more complete yes to each other. One evening, sitting on the porch with Sarah, watching the sun set behind the apple tree, I put it into words for her. A tree can lose branches in a storm. I said, my voice soft in the twilight. Some break, some are torn away. It looks battered for a while, but if its roots are deep, if it's planted in good soil, fed by good memories and strong love, it doesn't die. It heals. It grows new branches, stronger ones. It flowers again. She leaned her head on my shoulder, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. "We're still flowering, Dad," she whispered. And we were. Epilogue. The phone call. A year passed. A year of quiet healing. The seasons changed, and the house felt like a home again, its rhythms restored to the gentle hum of our two lives, intertwined and content. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was from a city a few hours away. I almost didn't answer, but something, some faint curiosity, made me pick up. "Robert?" The voice on the other end was familiar yet changed. Flatter. Softer. Devoid of the slick, calculating confidence it once held. It was Michael. My first instinct was cold anger. My second was to hang up. But a third instinct, a quieter, deeper one, made me pause. This wasn't the voice of a man calling to fight or to manipulate. This was the voice of a man who had been defeated. "What do you want, Michael?" I asked, my tone neutral, guarded. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear him breathing. I'd like to see you. Just for a few minutes. There's something I need to say. And to give you." I was silent, processing. The old Robert might have refused. The hurt Robert might have screamed. But the Robert who had won, who had found his peace, simply asked, "Why?" Another pause. "Because I need to," he said, and the raw honesty in those 3 words was more convincing than any elaborate apology could ever be. "Not for you, for me. To try and look at myself in the mirror again," I agreed. Not for him. For me. To close the circle. To prove to myself that I held all the power now, not the power to hurt him, but the power to choose my own peace over lingering bitterness. We met on a bench in a public park, halfway between our towns. He was already there when I arrived. He looked older, thinner. The expensive suit was replaced with a simple button-down shirt and jeans. He stood up as I approached, his hands empty except for a single, sealed envelope. He didn't try to shake my hand. He didn't smile. He just nodded, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was almost physical. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low. We sat. He held the envelope for a moment, then handed it to me. "This is a notarized document," he explained. "It formally and permanently renounces any claim, real or imagined, I ever had or could have on your property or assets. It's already filed with the county clerk. This is your copy. I know the divorce settlement already covered this, but I wanted you to have this from me, directly." I took the envelope. It felt heavy in my hand, not with paper, but with symbolism. It was his white flag, his tangible surrender. He looked down at his hands. "What I did, it was monstrous. It was greedy and selfish and weak. I wasn't the man Sarah deserved. I certainly wasn't the son-in-law you deserved. I saw your life, your home, your history, and I didn't see a family. I saw a transaction. I am deeply and truly sorry." He didn't ask for anything. He didn't ask to see Sarah. He didn't ask for my forgiveness. He simply stated his failure and his regret. I looked at this broken man on the bench, and I felt nothing. No anger, no hatred, no satisfaction. Just a quiet, profound sense of closure. The storm was over, and this was the last bit of rain dripping from the leaves. "I forgive you, Michael," I said. And I meant it. His head snapped up, shock in his eyes. He was waiting for the anger, for the lecture. He wasn't expecting this. But my forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for me. It was me finally putting down the heavy weight of his betrayal that I'd been carrying for over a year. Forgiving him was the last act of setting myself free. It was the final crucial boundary I drew around my own peace. "But you need to understand something," I continued, my voice calm but firm. "I forgive you because it is not in my character to hold on to poison. I forgive you because my peace is more valuable than my pride. But that forgiveness doesn't come with a reward. You were not the kind of man I hoped for my daughter." "Who knows?" I said, offering the faintest, most conditional sliver of hope. "Not for him, but for the concept of redemption itself. Maybe one day, somewhere else, you can become that man. For yourself first." He nodded, tears welling in his eyes. He understood. The forgiveness was real, but the consequences were permanent. The door was not opening again. He stood up, wiped his eyes, and simply said, "Thank you, Robert." Then he turned and walked away. I sat on the bench for a long time watching the ducks on the pond. The envelope lay beside me. I thought about Margaret. I thought about roots and branches and storms. I had lost a branch, yes, but my roots had held firm. Forgiveness doesn't mean the injury never happened. It means it no longer controls you. I had protected my home. I had safeguarded my family. And in the end, I had chosen to keep the one thing no one could ever steal from me: my own character. I stood up, picked up the envelope, and walked back to my car. The sun was warm on my face. It was time to go home.